Good evening, everybody. Welcome, welcome. My name is Scott Kalmakoff. I am the coordinator for the Union of Traditional Judaism. I want to thank you all for being here this evening for tonight's webinar. Rabbi Eliezer, Warm Yourself by the Fire of Sages, the third and final class in the series of webinars on Masorah makhloket with Dr. Yardaena Osband. Please note that this program is being recorded. Also, everyone is muted, but we welcome questions and comments in the chat, and we'll do our best to address them during the webinar. Before we begin, I'd like to thank our sponsors for this webinar series, our partners, Rabbi Gerald Benita and Nathan Sussman, in celebration of their grandson, Ozzy Vidan's bar mitzvah, our friends, Mitch Morrison, in celebration of Dr. Osband's professional and spiritual contributions, continuing the wisdom of her beloved father, Alav Shalom, and Leonard Chabiston, in memory of all of his relatives who were lost in the Shoah. Finally, let me introduce you to our speaker this evening, and then I'll turn it over to her. Yardaena Osband, MD, is an assistant clinical professor of pediatrics at New York. Well, I'm not sure, this might have changed now that Dr. Osband is living in Israel. It is 2 o'clock in the morning, and she is on this call with us, friends, okay? She is a...
You outed me.
I outed you. So who knows? This could have, this is probably an outdated bio now, but we'll get to the good stuff.
No, I'm still working there. That's what's amazing about this world today.
Wow, amazing. Okay, so Yardaena Osband, MD, is an assistant clinical professor of pediatrics at New York Medical College in Valhalla, New York. Yardaena studied for 2 years in Midreshet Lindenbaum and received her BA in Jewish Studies and Music at Yeshiva University, Stern College for Women. Yardaena attended medical school at the Sackler School for Medicine and completed her residency in pediatrics at the Maria Ferrari Children's Hospital in Valhalla, New York. Yardaena has taught in many schools, synagogues, and has been scholar in residence in many communities. She lectures on Tanakh, Halacha, and Talmud, with a specific interest in the biographies of the Tanaim and Amoraim. She's also the co-host of Daf Yomi podcast, Talking Talmud. Yardaena also serves on the board of ORA, Organization for the Resolution of Agunot, the Riverdale Minyan, and is a founder of the Orthodox Leadership Project. She and her family also started the Michael E. Osband Senior Swab campaign with Gift of Life. Yardaena currently resides in no longer New York, but in Modi'in with husband and children. With that, I'd like to thank Dr. Osband for being with us this late at night in Israel, 2 o'clock in the morning, and I'm going to hand it over to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for having me. And I'm excited to sort of close out this 3-part series. So I'm just going to share my screen. And some of the things that we've been talking about before in our first class, we talked about sort of the idea of Masorah, looking at the first parak of Pirkei Avot. And in the second class, we explored some ideas around what exactly is makhloket, why do we have makhloket, and, you know, sort of using the story of Rabban Gamliel and Rabbi Eliezer ben Azariah, that maybe makhloket actually gives us an opportunity, as Rabbi Eliezer ben Azariah says, to be kaneh lecha lev lahavim lishmoa, to practice radical empathic listening. And actually that leads us to better learning and to better understanding of Torah. Tonight, I really want to go through a third story and a third Tana, who is Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus. And this sort of, whereas I think we sort of had two, maybe I presented two extremes, one which really was the integrity of Masorah, and the second one of, no, makhloket is amazing and it can be great. Today, I want to look at what happens to Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus and maybe a different perspective on makhloket itself. So as we learn together, feel free to either unmute yourself and ask a question or put something in the chat. If there's a question, I seem not to be looking at the chat, you can really just chime in. So I want to start with going back to Pirkei Avos, where we began at our first session, with a Mishnah from Perek Bet Mishnah Yud. And this is Heimam Shad Devarim. Here we're talking about the students of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, and Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus was one of his students. And he said three things. Rabbi Eliezer Omer, Yihi kavod chavercha chabib alayich kishalcha. So he said the honor of your friend should be as dear to you as your own honor. V'al tehi noach lichos, and you shouldn't get angry easily. V'shuv yom echad lifnei mitatecha, and you want to make sure that to make sure to do tshuva one day before you die, which basically is saying nobody knows when they're going to die. So every day you should treat basically as the day before you're going to die. And then we just said that Rabbi Eliezer was going to say three things. So those were the three things, right? Counted, the kavod, not getting angry quickly, when to do tshuva. And then we end with this very, very strange statement of his. V'have mitchamim keneged uran shel chachamim, v'have zakir begal chatan shelo techabeh, shenish chatan nishchat shu'al, v'aksitzatan aksat akrev, ulish chatan lishchat sarev, v'chol dibraim kegachlei esh. And he finally ends by saying, you should warm yourself by the fire of the sages, but be cautious around their coals, that you should not be burned. For their bite is the bite of a fox, their sting is the sting of a scorpion, and their hiss is the hiss of a, seraph, and all their words are like burning coals. Very, very interesting statement that we have of Rabbi Eliezer. And so I really want to use this mission to start up with, what was it about Rabbi Eliezer's life that would lead him to say something like this? He was sort of one of the most prominent chachamim. He was also known, we'll see this later in one of the sources, really to be a proponent of Beit Shammai, which we know tends to have, let's say, a little bit of a harsher outlook, or let's say a more stricter outlook on life. And yet here he makes a statement that, first of all, it's about being sure to be very careful with your friend's feeling, make sure not to get angry quickly, make sure you're always actively involved in tshuva. And then there's this last statement, which seems to be unconnected to the Shlosha Devarim, which is basically saying you really have to be careful about the Chachamim. The Chachamim really, if you get too close, they can really burn you. And so what is it Rabbi Eliezer is really trying to express here? So I want to go through a couple of sources to give us a little bit of a better background about who Rabbi Eliezer is. So again, he's of this generation after Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, where there were sort of these five famous Talmidim. You can look in the second chapter of Perkei Avot to learn about more of the Talmidim. And here's another interesting story about him. And again, keep in mind what we just learned about him in Perkei Avot. Masa Rabbi Eliezer, Sheyarad Lifnei Ateva. So there was a story with Rabbi Eliezer. Whenever it says Yarad Lifnei Ateva, it means they were going to serve as the Shaliach Tzibur. They were going to lead the prayers. Va'amar Esrim va'arba'a brachot below nana Yarad. And he goes in front to, it was a time where there was no rain, and he basically says 24 blessings, and he's not answered, right? Yavrad Rabbi Akiva comes, right, Acharav after him, Va'amar, Avinu Malkeinu, Ein Lanu Melech Ela Ata, Avinu Malkeinu L'mancha Rachem Aleinu. So Rabbi Akiva comes and he gives the following, and remember, Rabbi Akiva is Rabbi Eliezer's student, and he says he's the next generation of Tanaim. And he says the following blessing. He says, our Father, our King, we have no king other than you. Our Father, our King, for your sake, have mercy on us. And what happens? Right away, what happens? Rain falls. So here you have Rabbi Eliezer, right? The Rebbe, he comes and he gives 24 blessings and nothing happens. And then his Talmud comes, Rabbi Akiva, and he just says this very sort of seemingly simple prayer. And all of a sudden, rain falls. So what happens? Right? So all the sages, all the rabbis, they start to whisper. They're very puzzled by what they see. How could it be that Rabbi Eliezer's prayer is not answered and Rabbi Akiva's is? Yatzta Bakol. So a Bakol comes out. So if I'm ever asked to come back to speak here again, we could do a whole series just on the Bakol. But a Bakol is basically sort of serves in the Gemara as a literary, some people will take it literally, or some people say it's figurative, but the bakhol is a device that comes when there's something that sort of humans would not be able to observe or understand on their own. There's a bakhol that comes out to sort of explain what isn't obvious to human perception. And this bakhol comes out and says, Amra. Well, and it's also interesting, the bakhol is always in a feminine voice as well, which I always wonder if it's because we say women have bina, but again, I digress a little bit. Lo mipnei shezeh gadol mizeh, right? It doesn't have to do with one was greater than the other. It's not that Rabbi Akiva is greater than Rabbi Eliezer. Ela shezeh ma'avir al midotav, b'zeh eino ma'avir al midotav. Says it's because one is forgiving and one is not forgiving. And that is why God responded to Rabbi Akiva, because Rabbi Akiva had this midah of being forgiving, and Rabbi Eliezer did not have this midah of being forgiving. And if you remember in the second class, when we talked about some of the Gemaras, the one in Eruvin that talked about why do we paskin like Beit Hillel, not like Hillel, not like Shammai, and it said because Hillel always sort of taught the words of Shammai first, sort of was open to Shammai. When we saw the midah that we saw of Rabbi Eliezer ben Azariah of Kanevach Lev Labin Lishmoa, there seems to be this idea that sort of the person who's sort of more forgiving or more open to others, that's who we're going to psak halacha from, and that Rabbi Eliezer here is being described as not forgiving, and yet we still have this Mishnah in Pirkei Avos where he seems to be the one who's sort of not forgiven. He's the one who really was burned by the Chachamim. Then we have this Gemara in Chagiga, which is a Brisa, Titania Masaber Rabbi Yossi Durmaskid. So there was a story, an incident involving Yossi ben Durmaskid, Shalach Lagbil Panav Rabbi Eliezer ben Lud. So we went to Rabbi Eliezer in Lod. That's where Rabbi Eliezer's yeshiva was, that's where he lived. Amar lo, machidu shaya, right? So he says to him, machidu shaya bebeit hamidrash. What chiddush was learned today in the Beit Hamidrash? What new or innovative thing was learned in the Beit Hamidrash? Amar lo, sorry, I read this wrong. Rabbi Eliezer says to him, what was learned? And Rabbi Yossi ben Durmaskid says to him, right? Nemnu v'gamru Amon u'Moav masrin maser ani b'shvi, right? So he basically says to him, he says to Rabbi Eliezer, the Chachamim got together, they counted, right? So in other words, that they ruled by majority, and they concluded that in the lands of Ammon and Moab, meaning not in what we consider to be classic Eretz Yisrael, but sort of over the Yardaena, right? Right? That we still have to do Maser Sheni, right? We know that during the Shemitah cycle, that on years, that we still have to do Maser Ani, that on the Shemitah cycle in year 3 and on year 6, instead of taking Maser Sheni, which is what you would take to go up to Yerushalayim if you were a farmer, those years that Maser, that tithing that you did, would go to the poor person. And so that even in those lands that are classically not thought of as being part of Eretz Yisrael, we would still have to, you would still have to do it. So Amar Lo, so what does Rabbi Eliezer say to him? Now, one thing I want you to think about here is, it's a little interesting. Here we have Rabbi Eliezer. Why is it that he's not in the Beit Midrash? And we're going to get to that in a little bit later. So he says to him, Amar Lo Yossi, Pashu Yadayach, V'kabel Einayach. So he says to him, put your hands out and catch your eyes. All right. Literally what it means is your eyes are about to fall out of your sockets. Right. And what happens? So he puts his hands out and his eyes basically fall out. Rabbi Eliezer starts to cry. The Amar. And he quotes this pasuk from Tehillim, Sod Hashem l'Rayab ubrito lahodiam, right? Which says the counsel of Hashem is with them who fear him, and his covenant to make them known, right? So what he's saying is basically what the Mefarshim explainers said. What he's saying is that yes, they may have come to the right conclusion, but they didn't really understand why. The Beit Midrash wasn't really sure, or how they learned this halacha was not actually correct. So then he says, Amar Lo, he goes back to Yossi, and he says to him, right, and more lahem, right, go back to the Chachamim, go back to them, right, and what should you say to them? Al tachashu l'minichem, don't worry about your counting, right? In other words, don't worry about who said that this was the right halacha. Don't worry about the majority here, okay, right? Kach mikublani mi Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai. This is the Mesorah, right? Remember that same word that we saw of being Moshe Kivel Torah, right? This is the word of the Mesorah that we saw in the first parak of Pirkei Avot, right? This is the Mesorah that I got from Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. Sheshama v'rabo mi rabo halachta l'Moshe miSinai, right? He's saying this is a halacha that goes all the way back to Moshe. This is the original Mesorah. And what Rabbi Eliezer is worried about is that the Chachamim in the Beit Midrash, that Rabbi Yossi came to discuss with him, they don't actually know this Masorah. And what is the Masorah? Amonu Moab Masrin Maser Ani B'Shvit, right? So he says, yes, the land, the people who are farming in Ammon and Moab, they do Maser Ani, right, in the 7-year cycle. Matam, what's the reason? Harbe Krachim Kivshu Ulei Mitzrayim, V'lo Kivshu Ulei Babel. Mipnei Shekadusha Rishona Kadsha L'Shata, V'lo Kadsha L'Atid Lavo. Right, so what is the reason? Because those who came from Mitzrayim and they conquered all those cities. Remember, that's the whole story with Reuben, Gad, and Chatzi, Shevet, Menashe, right? Remember, they wanted to live, and they wanted to live not in Eretz Yisrael proper, but on the other side of the Yardaena. And this was the, this was the sort of the first kibush haaretz. This was the first time that we conquered the land. And he says those who came from Bavel, right? That would be in the Shivat Zion, right? The times of Ezra, the times of Ezra and Nehemiah, right? They did not conquer those lands. They didn't conquer any part of Ammon and of Moab. And so therefore, what? So therefore, that kedusha, right? V'anicham kadeshis mechu aleim aniyim b'shvi, right? Tana la'achar shenit yashvav dato amar yehi ratzon shechazru enei yosi l'makom v'chazru. So what he says is that land of Ammon and Moab, that always maintained a particular type of kedusha, even because it was conquered in the first kibush Eretz Yisrael, even though it wasn't reconquered in the second one. And we wanted to make sure that the poor of Eretz Yisrael, right, would always have enough food to rely on. And so therefore, we gave them that for Maser Ani. And so once he basically gives that teaching, right, it says, notice the language here, Nitjashva dato, he basically, he stops being so angry. Rabbi Yossi's eyes, he basically gives a prayer that Rabbi Yossi's eyes should return in their place, and they were basically returned. And so this is a very interesting story here. We're seeing a few things here. First of all, that Rabbi Eliezer is not with the rest of the Chachamim. He's somehow not in the Beit Midrash. So that's one question we need to answer. And also here we sort of see again, sort of this harshness of personality, and not just a sort of harshness, but that Rabbi Eliezer seems to function somewhere not exactly in our world. There's something miraculous. He's tuned into a piece of the Masorah that seems to go all the way back from his teacher, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, all the way back to Moshe Rabbeinu. But at the same time, he tapped into something that his anger is so great, he's able to do something supernatural. And I think that's why the previous story with Rabbi Akiva, where he was unable to pray and bring about rain, was even more puzzling to everybody. Because here you have Rabbi Eliezer, who's known for being able to bring miracles about, or to do something, or to function in the supernatural world, and he couldn't bring rain, and it was his Talmud of Rabbi Akiva who could. And that's why they had to be able to give that explanation. But we see sort of this unforgiving, I would say this sort of this unforgiving midah, this unforgiving behavior of Rabbi Eliezer in this particular story. He's so upset. It's not, the Chachamim came to the right conclusion. They were right that you do Maser Ani in these lands, but he was upset that the Masorah, that the tradition was lost. And so what we see here for the first time, I think what this story illustrates is, yes, we can have, that the integrity of the Masorah is very, very important. And it's not so much about counting or doing the majority, right? Which is one way we talked about how makhloket is resolved, right? We just follow the majority. But he's saying the integrity of the Masorah itself, how did you get to the correct conclusion, is just as important as arriving to the correct halakha. I'm just going to check the chat because it looks like there's a couple of messages here. Right, so Mitch talks about the Tanor Aknai. We're going to talk about that. That's going to be the punchline of this year here. And Noah, you mentioned here, right, this idea of Noach Lichos, right? It's something like that he sort of was able to be calmed down, right? But I think what we see is that he can't actually, he's not a particularly calm person. He is a person who actually gets very, very angry. And so now what I want to do is go through really the most famous story of Rabbi Eliezer that Mitch mentioned before, which is the story of the Tanur Shel Aknai, the oven of Aknai. And it's interesting also, I didn't quote the whole Gemara. Whenever I prepare these source sheets and you sort of take out a piece of a Gemara, it's important to sort of go back and look at, well, what was the context? Why did this come about? And the Gemara is actually discussing the issue of sort of verbal mistreatment, right? When people are not treated nicely through words. And an example that they give of this is the makhloket that happens with Tanur Shel Aknai. So I just realized I forgot to set this up that it's side by side. So I may just go back and forth also for the sake of time between the English and the Hebrew. And so this basically starts out quoting a famous Mishnah in Kalim, right? Tanan Hatam. And so the story that they're talking about here, so again, I apologize, I'm going to do this source in English just for the sake of time because it's a rather very long source. So there's a Mishnah here in Kalim in chapter 5, verse 10, that talks about a particular case of the Tanur Shel Aknai. And what is that? It's an oven that's made out of clay, okay, that somehow gets broken into pieces and it gets put back together by putting sand in between each piece. And so the question is this considered to be sort of a complete kli? Is it considered to be a complete vessel? And can it be mekabel tuma? Can it become tameh? Or does it become tahor? Because we say it's not really a complete vessel because it's sort of only being kept together by the sand and it's not really subject to ritual impurity. It can't really become tameh. Now, we're not going to get into the technicalities of the tuma and tahara. That's not the important point here. But this is the famous case of what we call the Tanur Shel Aknai. And so Rabbi Eliezer basically says that it's ritually pure. It can only stay tahor. And the rabbis say that it's ritually impure. It's a completed kli. And therefore it can actually be makabel tuma. And this is the Tanur Shel Aknai. So the Gemara basically asks, okay, why are we talking about this Tanur Shel Aknai? What does this have to do with our topic of verbal mistreatment, right? And so Rav Yehuda said that Shmuel said that when the rabbis surrounded it with their statements like a snake, okay? And that's why it's called a Tanur Shel Aknai, because an Aknai is a snake. And when it came to the makhloket around this, okay, what it's saying is that the way we're talking about how the Chachamim discussed or expressed their opinion, it was like a snake that coils around something, right? And so what comes to mind when you think of that imagery of like a snake coiling around something? Is that depicting something nicely, not nicely? Like, what is it saying about the opinion of the rabbis, that their statement, that their opinion is considered to be like a snake? Okay, we'll just look in the actual Gemara itself. Sheikfiu dvarim ka'achna, right? That's how they supported their words, like a snake. So, right, when a snake coils around something, it's like they're not going to let it go at all, right? So I don't think this is saying something nice about the majority, about the Chachamim, and about their opinion, right? So what happens that day? So the Tanu Rabbi, right, the sages teach on that day. On that day, when this was being discussed, Rabbi Eliezer answered all possible answers in the world to support his opinion, right? And the rabbis didn't accept any explanation from him. So basically, Rabbi Eliezer comes, he says, this is not a real oven, it's not a real kli, it cannot become tameh. The Chachamim come and they say, no, it's a real kli, it can become tameh. And Rabbi Eliezer basically starts by explaining his opinion. And again, this is the same Rabbi Eliezer who it's not important to him who the majority is. It's important to him who is the Masorah, that the Masorah is actually being learned out correctly. And the rabbis don't accept his explanation. And so once he can't convince him of everything, Rabbi Eliezer says to him the following. And remember, this is Rabbi Eliezer who does not function totally in the laws of nature. He functions in a supernatural world. And so he says, if the halakha is in accordance with my opinion, this carob tree will prove it. So they're in the Beit Midrash. There's a carob tree, I guess, outside. And so what happens? The carob tree was uprooted from its place, 100 cubits, and some say 400 cubits, okay? So in other words, this weird miracle happens that the carob tree sort of uproots itself in front of everybody. And the rabbis say, what? One doesn't cite halachic proof from a carob tree. We don't care that something supernatural just happened for you, Rabbi Eliezer. We know you function in the supernatural world. No, this is the majority. This is the opinion that we hold. This tanur shalaknai can become tameh. We don't care that you say it's always tahor. This is not a proof for us. Rabbi Eliezer then says to them, if the halacha is in accordance with my opinion, the stream will prove it. And what happens? The water in the stream turned backwards and basically begins flowing in the opposite direction, right? So that's like a real miracle. When have you ever seen a stream? Actually, I think that just happened during Hurricane Ida, right? They said that some of the winds were so strong that some of the rivers actually flowed the opposite way. But in other words, this was like a miracle that happened. And so again, what did the rabbis say? They said to him, one does not cite a proof from a stream. So then Rabbi Eliezer says to them, if the halacha is in accordance with my opinion, the walls of the study hall, the walls of the Beit Midrash is going to prove it. And so what happens? The walls of the study hall start to lean in. So everybody's in the Beit Midrash, right? First, Rabbi Eliezer tries to convince everybody, by citing these two sort of supernatural things that happen. The tree gets uprooted, the water goes upstream. Now, sorry, one other thing I want to mention here is I also think it's significant that it's a tree and it's water, right? Because first of all, we always compare the Torah to like an Eitz Chaim Chi. We also compare Torah to water. So I think there's some significance here that those are sort of the two miracles that happen, right? That it's, like the roots that get uprooted, right? In a way that by not going with Rabbi Eliezer's opinion, you're sort of uprooting the Masorah, and also water, which is like foundational to life, right? Behaves in a way that it's not supposed to behave. So I think that's also an important part of this story here. So finally, the third miracle that he has happened here is that the walls of the Beit Midrash start to cave into everybody. And now Rabbi Yeshua, our old friend Rabbi Yeshua from that story with Rabbi Gamliel and Rabbi Eliezer ben Azariah, right? Rabbi Gamliel who had picked on Rabbi Yeshua. Rabbi Yeshua, basically, what does he do? He yells at the walls, he scolds the walls and said to them, right? If Torah scholars are contending with each other in matters of halacha, what's the nature of your involvement in this dispute? In other words, he's basically saying to the walls of the Beit Midrash, this is something that the Chachamim get to discuss. You don't have any part of this, the walls in the Beit Midrash. You're not allowed to express your opinion. And so what happens? The walls did not fall because of deference to Rabbi Yeshua, but they did not straighten out of deference to Rabbi Eliezer because they remained leaning. And so you basically have sort of the two major Chachamim, Rabbi Yeshua, right, who we'll see later on really was sort of the house of Hillel, and Rabbi Eliezer. The Beit Midrash, the walls are sort of like this. They can't get straightened, but they go in at the same time because nobody knows what to do here. There's a challenge here to the Masorah itself. Here you have Rabbi Eliezer, who gives all the correct arguments for why his opinion about the Tanur Shalknai is correct. The Chachamim come and say, we're not going to listen to you. We rule by majority, and this is what the majority is going to say. He tries to convince them through the supernatural world. And finally, Rabbi Yeshua says, no, nobody else gets to decide the halacha. And then finally, we sort of get the, so then Rabbi Eliezer basically says to them, if the halacha is in accordance with my opinion, heaven will prove it. And then we get again, a bat kol comes out, right? A divine voice emerges. So again, this is Yatzta bat kol. And the bat kol says, why are you differing with Rabbi Eliezer, right? As the halacha is really according to him in every place. We should actually always follow Rabbi Eliezer. So it's not just that the bat kol comes out to say, in this particular case of the Tanur Shalaknai, Rabbi Eliezer is correct, but really Rabbi Eliezer is always correct, okay? That's what Rabbi Eliezer is saying. And then finally, Rabbi Yeshua stands up and he says the very famous phrase that gets quoted very, very often when we talk about issues about makhloket, right? And very, very famous name of a book by Eliezer Berkovitz, right? That's a quote from Devarim, chapter 30, verse 12, Lo bashamayim hi. And what does Rabbi Yeshua mean by that? That matters of halacha and how they're decided They are not decided in Shamayim. And this is a very key point about issues of makhloket. Yes, the Torah is given to us. Yes, the Torah is given to us supernaturally, right? When we look at the descriptions of how the Torah was given with the thunder and the lightning and the kolot, it was given through a miracle. But what do we say? Lo bashamayim. The actual practical discussion about and surrounding halacha, according to Rabbi Yeshua, it is not decided in Shamayim. Rabbi Eliezer, it cannot be decided by your miracles. It cannot be decided by the walls of the Beit Midrash. It cannot be decided even by a bat kol coming out. It is lo bashamayim hi. And so the Gemara says, what does it mean when it says lo bashamayim hi? Rabbi Yirmiyah says the Torah was already given at Mount Sinai. We do not regard a divine voice, as you already wrote at Mount Sinai in the Torah, after a majority to incline, right? We're always going to go with the majority. And so that is a key point here. And so it's interesting that the second class that we did in this series, where we talked about issues of makhloket, and we sort of said, okay, you're just going to go by the majority. And that sort of seems very logical to us, right? 2 out of 3, that's who just we should follow. But we see in this Gemara, in this story of the Tanur Shel Gnai, that there's actually a little bit of tension around the idea of following the majority. That it really could be that the correct halacha could not be, could follow Rabbi Eliezer. He's always going to be sort of the singular opinion. And what we learn from this story is that what? No, the way halacha actually practices, it needs to be by the majority. It's not lo bashamayim hi. And we really have to actually follow the majority. And we don't care how many miracles or how many things Rabbi Eliezer brings, but we have to follow that majority. The Gemara here takes a little bit of a digression and tells the following story that Rabbi Natan one time encounters or has a visit with Eliyahu Navi, and he says to him, right, what did the Holy One, blessed be He, do at the time when Rabbi Yeshua issued his declaration? In other words, what was Hashem's reaction to Rabbi Yeshua saying, Lo bashamayim hi, right? That in a way that Hashem has no participation in how halacha gets decided anymore. God, Shamayim, is not part of it anymore. And so Eliyahu says to Rabbi Natan, he says to him that Hashem smiled and said, my children have triumphed over me, my children have triumphed over me. Meaning this story, this encounter with Eliyahu Navi is here to teach us as well, right? That this is really how Hashem wanted it to be, right? Hashem didn't want that Hashem would always have to be involved in order to teach everything. Now, I think this story also is a little bit of a way of asserting the majority of the Chachamim, because remember, in Bayit Rishon, how would things be decided? That there really was a halachic question that they couldn't understand. Does anybody know how would things be decided?
Yeah, the Urim V'Tumim.
Right, the Urim V'Tumim, right? You would basically go to the Urim V'Tumim and, right, you would go to the breastplate. The question would be asked to the Kohen Gadol and it would be lighted up. We know in the second Beit HaMikdash, there was no Urim V'Tumim, but here we're talking about halachic authority post Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, post Beit HaMikdash. And so essentially this lo bashamayim hi, what Rabbi Yeshua is basically saying is, and think about it, this is something that only comes out in diaspora Judaism, is that once we are severed from the Beit HaMikdash, once we are severed from an opportunity to even go to God directly, God's not involved with halacha anymore. The Masorah sort of functions very, very independently. And so that's also a little bit of what's happening in this Gemara, is that part of what Rabbi Yeshua and the Beit Midrash is trying to assert is that in a post Beit HaMikdash world, in a post world where there's no direct connection anymore, it's going to be the majority. It's lo bashamayim hi. It is not connected to anything supernatural or anything in God's world. I'm just going to check the chat very quickly. So Mitch here says that Rabbi Eliezer's passion for the Masorah speaks to his sense of fundamentalism, right? I would agree with that. But it also seems that Chazal's view also seems to be very extreme as well. And you brought in here a couple of other points here, specifically about Reb Dessler, that he said he'd rather have one truly faithful person to the Masorah than 100 if he was forced to compromise. So, okay, so we'll talk about that in a little bit, about where does Rabbi Eliezer, where does this fit in in sort of a broader view about fundamentalism here. And so do we view this as really a criticism against Rabbi Eliezer? So I think that's what we have to see. So initially, when we're reading this Gemara, it does seem very critical of Rabbi Eliezer. And those previous stories also about Rabbi Eliezer seem to depict him as somebody who is particularly very, very harsh, right? And so what happens here? So then the Chachamim go on, the teaching continues and says, on that day, the sages brought all ritually pure items that were deemed pure by Rabbi Eliezer. So anything that Rabbi Eliezer said that was tahor, right? By this ruling of the Tanur Shel Aknai, they brought all those items, and what did they do? They burned them in the fire, okay? So they also now take sort of like an equally extreme view of Rabbi Eliezer. And I think some of what this story is teaching us is that like fundamentalism sort of breeds fundamentalism. So here you have Rabbi Eliezer, who's so extreme in his view. And so how do the Chachamim respond? They respond also in an extreme manner. They bring anything that Rabbi Eliezer would have said was tahor, using this principle of Tanur Shel Aknai, and they burn it in an oven. Now remember, this is very, very different than that Mishnah in Edjot that we learned about with Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai, right? Which said, yeah, one said something was tameh, one said something was tahor, but they borrowed all their dishes from each other, right? They borrowed kalim. If Beit Shammai said it was tahor, Hillel would treat it as if it was tahor. So so that's so here we see something very different. They're not willing to accept it at all as tahor, and so they burn everything. And then what do? The Chachamim reach a consensus in his regard, and they ostracize him. Basically, because of Rabbi Eliezer's behavior and his fundamentalism and his refusal to go with the majority, they put him in Cherem. And so then the Chachamim say, who will go and inform him? Who is going to go and tell Rabbi Eliezer he's no longer welcome in the Beit Midrash? So now this explains, I did do these stories a little bit out of order, that this is why Rabbi Yossi had to go visit him. He was not really allowed in the Beit Midrash, and that's why he sort of had to hear secondhand what was happening in the Beit Midrash. And so they say, Rabbi Akiva, who was his Talmud, his student, right? He says to them, I will go because I'll be sure I will go lest an unseemly person goes, and he would therefore destroy the entire world. So let's unpack this a little bit. His student says, I'm going to be the one to tell him, but there's also a great fear here. There's a fear here. They know Rabbi Eliezer has this connection to Shamayim, right? Rabbi Eliezer is connected to the halacha of Shamayim, and therefore the fear is that if Rabbi Eliezer is not told in the right way, what is going to happen? The whole world is going to be destroyed. So what did Rabbi Akiva do? He wore black and wrapped himself in black, right? So he's expressing himself as mourning, sat before Rabbi Eliezer at a distance of 4 amot, right? Because the idea is that if somebody is cherem, if somebody is no longer part of the community, you're not allowed to actually sit near them. Rabbi Eliezer says to him, Rabbi Akiva, what's different today from others' day, right? So he's saying to Rabbi Akiva, he's like, why are you wearing black? Why are you sitting so far from me? Rabbi Akiva says to him, my teacher, it appears to me that your colleagues are distancing themselves from you, right? It seems that your colleagues are not going to be with you anymore. He didn't want to say straight out you're in Cherem. So what does Rabbi Eliezer do? He tears his garments, removes his shoes, right? And drops from his seat and he sits on the ground. He realizes that now he severed his relationship with the rabbinic community, with the Beit Midrash. And so what happens? The Gemara says his eyes shed tears, he starts to cry. And as a result, the entire world was afflicted. 1/3 of its olives were afflicted, 1/3 of its wheat, and 1/3 of its barley. So in other words, basically a famine happens. Now again, think about what miracles happen with Rabbi Eliezer. He uproots a tree, right? He reverses water, and then the food of the world, right, basically gets uprooted. So yes, Rabbi Eliezer had to be put in Cherem, but at the same time, the physical world gets impacted, and there's a manifestation of the famine of Torah that's going to occur by not being able to hear the Masorah of Rabbi Eliezer, that physically the world is not going to be nourished either, right? And some say that even dough kneaded in a woman's hand spoiled. The sages taught there was great anger on that day, as any place that Rabbi Eliezer fixed his gaze was burned, right? So now, does that remind you of anybody? Do we know anybody else who that happens to? where they looked and everything would burn? Right? Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, when he comes out of the cave, right? He can't look at anything without it burning. So this is sort of an expression or a description of people who sort of live in the extreme, right? Where they, right? Remember, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai comes out of the cave after learning there for 12 years, and it's the Gemara and Brachos, and he basically is like, why are people working? Why are people not learning Torah? And everywhere he looks starts to burn, and he has to go back into the cave. He basically can't live in the real world. And even Rabbi Gamliel, right? This is the same Rabbi Gamliel that we talked about. Rabbi Gamliel II was the Nasi of the Sanhedrin and was the head of the Beit Midrash in Yavna. And ultimately, it was his decision to agree with ostracizing Rabbi Eliezer. He was on a boat at the time, and a large wave swelled over him and threatened to drown him. Rabbi Gamliel said, it seems to me that this is only for the sake of Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus. This type of thing would only happen because of Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus, because basically the world is being punished for mistreating him. Rabbi Gamliel stood on his feet and he said, he gives a prayer, Master of the universe, it is revealed in him before you that neither was it for my honor that I acted, nor was it for the honor of the house of my father that I acted. Rather, it was for your honor, so that the disputes will not proliferate in Israel. And in response, the sea calmed from its raging. So Rabbi Gamliel basically had to go to Hashem and say, look, I didn't do this because I was being makbid on my kavod. I did this because we needed to affirm that we follow the majority. Whether or not Rabbi Eliezer is right, we don't care. And then therefore, sort of the sea goes back and Rabbi Eliezer's anger is no longer allowed to be expressed. Now the Gemara tells us something more interesting. Ima Shalom was the wife of Rabbi Eliezer, is the sister of Rabbi Gamliel. And from that incident forward, Ima Shalom is one of the very famous women in the Gemara. And from that incident forward, she would not allow Rabbi Eliezer to lower his head. She would basically not allow Rabbi Eliezer to say Tachanun every day, because what she was worried is that when he would say Tachanun, right, which is sort of a sadder prayer where we ask for forgiveness, he would basically be upset about what happened to him, that he was put into Chayrim, and maybe he would pray that something would happen to her brother, to Rabbi Gamliel. And so she would not allow him to say Tachanun anymore. And there was a certain day where it was around Rosh Chodesh, and Ima Shalom basically counted incorrectly, and she thought it was a 30-day month instead of a 29-day month. Sorry, so she thought it was a 29-day month instead of a 32-day month. So she actually thought it was actually Rosh Chodesh. So she thought that he wasn't going to be saying Tachanun. Some people say what the story was is that a poor person came to the door and wanted to ask for tzedakah or wanted money for food, and so she was busy giving this poor person bread. But the point is that basically she left Rabbi Eliezer unsupervised for a particular period of time. And what did Rabbi Eliezer do? Rabbi Eliezer was able to say Tachanun. And then she sees that he says Tachanun. When she returned, she found him and saw that he says Tachanun. And she says to him, arise, you've killed my brother. And at that moment, she hears the shofar from the house of Rabbi Gamliel announcing that the Nasi died. Okay? Very, very interesting story. So again, we see that Rabbi Eliezer sort of seems to continue to function in this supernatural world. Rabbi Eliezer says to her, from where did you know that your brother would die? And she says to him, this is the tradition that I received from the house of the father, my father. All the gates of heaven are apt to be locked except for the gate of prayer of a victim of verbal mistreatment. So I just want to look at what it actually says here, right? She says, Kach mekublani. This is what Ima Shalom says. Now again, look, she's using the word of Masorah here. Mi beit avi abba, right? From my family, kol hasharim nenalim chutz misharei onya, right? All of somebody who is verbally mistreated, right? That gate is always open. And so this Gemara ends on this amazing twist. All along, when you're reading this Gemara, you're seeing sort of this harshness about Rabbi Eliezer, but yet ultimately, who seems to actually be sort of the victim or the hero of the story? It's not the Chachamim. Who is it? It's actually Rabbi Eliezer. It's actually saying that Rabbi Eliezer was verbally mistreated by the Chachamim. And that's why his prayer that Rabbi Gamliel would die was actually fulfilled. And so I think we see in this story sort of very differently than Rabbi Eliezer ben Azariah, which I think sort of presented that whole makhloket in the Beit Midrash with Rabbi Gamliel and Rabbi Yehoshua, and that the day that Rabbi Eliezer ben Azariah becomes the Nasi, and sort of we see this proliferation of Torah learning, here we see a very, very different model. Here we see a model, right, where when we have too much extreme, when we have too much fundamentalism, what happens? It actually wreaks havoc on the physical world itself. Crops are lost, people die, but yet there's still something here about that Rabbi Eliezer was ultimately correct, and he was mistreated. The way that the Chachamim treated, the way that they were only willing to listen to the majority, that they were not willing to necessarily be open to and listen to Rabbi Eliezer's opinion, which was the correct one. It's ultimately Rabbi Eliezer who is the one who is mistreated. And so again, I could probably talk about this story for another hour because I think there's a lot to unpack here, right? Because all throughout, you really think this is a story saying, no, we go through the majority, it's lo b'shamayim. But at the end, we have this statement with Ima Shalom, which is basically saying Her Mesorah is one that verbal mistreatment, how we do makhloket, is also really, really important. Here I just have the actual quote here from Devarim, from the Pasuk of Sanhedrin. And so finally, what I want to end with is two more stories here. We are running out of time here. So again, I'm just going to switch to the English. So this is a Gemara here from Sanhedrin. So what happened? So we know that Rabbi Eliezer is basically in Chayrim because of this famous story with the Tanor Shel Aknai. And so what happens? Rabbi Eliezer gets sick, and meaning he's going to die. And Rabbi Akiva and his colleagues come to visit him. So yes, he's been in Chayrim all these years, but they come to visit him. He was sitting on his canopy bed and they were sitting in his parlor, right? So one way to understand this is maybe they didn't know if he wanted visitors while he was sick. Maybe they also were still separate from him because he was in Chayrim. And on that day, it was Erev Shabbat, and Rabbi Eliezer's son Hyrcanus went in to remove Rabbi Eliezer's tefillin because we don't wear tefillin on Shabbat. And his father yelled at him, berated him, and left reprimanded. And Hyrcanus said to all the colleagues, he says, it appears to me that my father went insane, right? Hyrcanus says, of course I have to take his tefillin off. It's about to be Shabbat, right? This was in the time when many of the rabbis wore tefillin all day. And so he says to his colleagues, he says, look how sick my father is. It looks like he went crazy. Rabbi Eliezer heard this and he says to all of them, he says, Hyrcanus, and his mother went insane, right? He says, how could they neglect Shabbos preparations with regard to prohibitions that are punishable by stoning, right? Such as lighting candles and preparing hot food, and engage in preparations that are prohibitions by rabbinic decree, that like wearing tefillin. So in other words, what he says is, he goes, no, I'm not crazy. My son and my wife is, right? Ima Shalom, right? What are they worried about me wearing tefillin? Not wearing tefillin is just a rabbinic decree that you can't do on Shabbat. They should be worried about making sure that everything is ready for Shabbat itself, that all the food is prepared, anything that that is one of the malachot, one of the things that you're really not allowed to do on Shabbat. And then it goes on, it says, since the sages perceived from this retort that his mind was stable, they entered and they sat before him a distance of 4 cubits. So they come closer to him, but they still remain this Dalet Amot apart from him because he's in Chayrim. And so Rabbi Eliezer says to him, he says, why did you come? And they said to him, we came to study Torah with you, right? They didn't want to necessarily say they came because he was sick, but finally, after all these years, they say, we wanted to come and study Torah with you. Rabbi Eliezer says to them, why did you not come until now? And they said, we didn't have time. And Rabbi Eliezer said to them, I would be surprised if these sages die their own death. So he basically again says, he knows they're not really telling the truth. And he says, I would be surprised if they're going to die a natural death. And so Rabbi Akiva then says to him, he says, what's going to happen? How am I going to die? And Rabbi Eliezer says to his student, your death will be worse than theirs, right? Because you were my student and you didn't come to study with me. And we know that ultimately, Rabbi Akiva, what? He's tortured by the Romans. And so again, it's a question of, did Rabbi Eliezer have some nevuah? Did Rabbi Eliezer sort of curse Rabbi Akiva here? But we see that Rabbi Eliezer, again, always seems to function not necessarily in the rules of this natural world. Rabbi Eliezer then raises his 2 arms and places them on his heart, and he says, woe to you, my 2 arms, as they are like 2 Torah scrolls that are now being rolled up and will never be opened again. I've learned much Torah and I've taught much Torah. I've learned much Torah and I have not taken away from my teachers, right? I've not received from their wisdom, even like a dog lapping from the sea. So Rabbi Eliezer even says he didn't even learn everything he could have from his teachers. And then he says, I've taught much Torah and my students have taken away from me, right? They got my wisdom, only like the tiny amount of paintbrush removes from a tube of paint, right? So he's saying his students learned almost nothing from him. Moreover, I can teach 300 halachot with regard to the baheret, which is basically the white part of saraz, part of the leprosy mark, but no person has ever asked me anything about it. In other words, he's saying is, even when I taught halakha, I could never find a student who fully understood what I was teaching. Moreover, I can teach these 300 halachot, and some say that Rabbi Eliezer said 3,000 halachot with regard to the planting of cucumbers by sorcery, but no person ever asked me anything besides Akiva ben Yosef. His only student ever asked him anything was Akiva ben Yosef. And so then he goes ahead, he describes that story. We're gonna skip down to exactly what that story was about the cucumbers just for the sake of time. But again, it was a story about purity and things like that. And so what happens? So he basically is saying like, look, I barely learned the Torah of my teachers and my students barely learned the Torah from me. And part of that is also because he was in Chayron. So then the Gemara describes this very lengthy halachic discussion that they had on his deathbed. Okay, again, we won't go through all of it just for the sake of time, but I encourage you to open up the Gemara. And Rabbi Eliezer finally says to them that the halacha about the shoe that they're talking about, again, it's around the same halacha of Tanur Shel Tnai, about whether or not this particular shoe that they're talking about, is it considered to be a complete vessel and therefore can become tameh, or it isn't? And Rabbi Eliezer basically says the shoe that they're discussing is not a complete vessel and therefore it's tahor. And as he says that word, that it's tahor, his soul leaves him, and the Gemara describes it in purity itself. So he's discussing a halacha about tuman tara, and his soul leaves him in purity. Rabbi Yeshua stands on his feet and he says, the vow is permitted, the vow is permitted, meaning Rabbi Eliezer is no longer ostracized, okay? Now, Rabbi Akiva was not there actually at the moment of Rabbi Eliezer's death. At the conclusion of Shabbat, Rabbi Akiva sees the funeral procession on his way from Caesarea to Lod. Rabbi Akiva was striking his flesh in terrible anguish and regret until blood flowed to the earth. Now, again, this is almost to me like a premonition for how Rabbi Akiva is ultimately going to die. He began to eulogize Rabbi Eliezer in a row, right? They would make these rows, right, of the nichumim, of comforting. And he said, my father, the chariot of Israel and its horsemen, right? I have many coins, but I do not have a money changer to whom to give them to. Meaning Rabbi Akiva basically says, I have all these questions and I have nobody who I can actually answer them to. And so to me, this is such a devastating piece of what happens with Rabbi Eliezer, because there was this fundamentalism on both sides of Rabbi Eliezer and the Chachamim. But yet I think the Gemara basically says Rabbi Eliezer in a way is the protector of the Mesorah, this connection to the Torah of Shamayim. Ultimately, nobody really learned from him. And once he finally dies, Rabbi Akiva realizes all of these questions he's had. There were all these years that he could have gone and learned Torah from Rabbi Eliezer, and he's not going to actually be able to learn that Torah anymore. And so then finally we conclude with this last piece of Gemara from Nida, which says the following: Kol yamav shel Rabbi Eliezer hayu osin k'Rabbi Yoshua. All the days of Rabbi Eliezer's life, they would always go according to the opinion of Rabbi Yoshua, right? Rabbi Yoshua, who stood up and said, Lo b'shamayim here. La'achar petirato shel Rabbi Eliezer. After Rabbi Eliezer died, hichzir Rabbi Yoshua et hadavar liyoshno k'Rabbi Eliezer. What did Rabbi Yoshua do? He went back and he changed the halacha and he taught it according to who? According to Rabbi Eliezer. But he had to wait until that the personality of fundamentalism was no longer there. Once Rabbi Eliezer was no longer physically in this world, Rabbi Yoshua, the one who said, Lo b'shamayim hi, what was he able to do? He went back and reversed everything that he taught. And he said, no, we're actually going to teach this according to Rabbi Eliezer, because that's actually correct. The Shanoka Rabbi Eliezer b'chayat. My time, what's the reason? Lo mishum to Rabbi Eliezer Shamutihu. It's not because Rabbi Eliezer was from the house of Beit Shammai, right? B'savar abdinan kavate, b'chada abdinan kavate, b'acharinate, umishum kavado de Rabbi Eliezer, right? So he says what? It's not because, right? He says, what's the reason we didn't go according to Rabbi Eliezer during his lifetime? It's because he followed Beit Shammai, right? And the Chachamim basically said what? They said, right? If they held like Rabbi Eliezer in one situation, right? It was going to be difficult to not follow Rabbi Eliezer all of the time. So since Rabbi Eliezer was sort of always in the minority opinion, he held like Beit Shammai, and we couldn't only sometimes go according to Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Eliezer was such a towering halachic figure, we were going to have to always follow Rabbi Eliezer. Umishum kvodo de Rabbi Eliezer, lo matzina machinam behula achar p'tirato shel Rabbi Eliezer, tamatzanu mechanim bahar b'hachzir hadavar lishono. So therefore, due to his kavod, we could not really protest against him, right? But after his passing, we were able to protest. In other words, once he passed away, we were sort of able to say, this is where we're going to follow Rabbi Eliezer. This is where we're not going to follow Rabbi Eliezer. And so then Rabbi Yeshua was able to do some of the halakha according to Rabbi Eliezer. So, I know I went a little bit over time. I apologize. But, in conclusion, I think this story really provides us sort of with a very, the story of Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus really shows us a much more nuanced approach to makhloket, and also sort of shares with us what happens when makhloket sort of goes awry. And that here we sort of see some of the competing principles that we talked about before. It's very clear from all these Gemaras that Rabbi Eliezer is somehow tapped into the original Masorah. And not only is that Masorah is so strong, it's really Bashamayim. He's able to make supernatural things happen in this world. Ultimately, we hold by Loth Bashamayim, and we see that terribly, Rabbi Eliezer is basically mistreated by the Chachamim because of this Lo Bashamayim concept. He's ostracized, but in a way, it's not clear in that story of Tanur Shalaknai. I think we can really read that maybe Rabbi Eliezer is actually ultimately the victim. And it's not until he actually passes away that in a way the halacha is actually rectified and goes back to way that it's supposed to be. The Rabbi Yeshua, who is actually his, let's say, arch rival in the story of Tanur Shalaknai, is now able to say, okay, now that he's passed away, we're able to sort of go back and actually teach his halacha where it's appropriate to actually follow Rabbi Eliezer. And so I think the story of Rabbi Eliezer basically is a warning to us that yes, we can be correct. Yes, we can always be right. But when it comes to machlokas, we always need to be careful that we don't prove our point too much. We need to be able to hear another side. But yet, at the other hand, what I worry about was maybe had we listened to Rabbi Eliezer, right, that also in a way would have undermined the whole halachic system and how it needs to function outside of the Beit HaMikdash, that we really do need to follow the majority. So I'm happy to open it up to questions. Thank you so much for having me do this 3-part series with you all. And I hope this gave you something to think about issues around Masorah and Machloket. I see here that there's one comment here in the chat. I can stop sharing here. So Mitch here says, great share, very well thought out. And I appreciate that Yardaena went beyond where most people stop with the story of Tanur Shalaknai. Yes, thank you. I think that's always an issue with that story itself. Perhaps our takeaway is twofold. Once again, self-righteousness to the point where one cannot appreciate the sincerity of another view. And at the same time, it's a lesson that the majority should not castigate the view of minorities, right? I think that's ultimately what that story is really about. Indeed, the halakha teaches that the reason we preserve a minority view is because in the future, right, it may be used under certain circumstances to reflect changing circumstances. Absolutely, and we see that one of those changing circumstances was what? Was actually the death of Rabbi Eliezer. Once he dies, we were able to say, okay, there are going to be some times that we're actually going to follow Rabbi Eliezer. Any other questions or thoughts? Okay. Thank you very much. I know we went through a lot of text and I apologize that I could not do it all in Hebrew.
You covered a lot tonight. Thank you so
No,
much.
you're-
Thank you, Dr. Osband, for
Thank
all
you
your
so much.
time. It's been wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Osband. And again, thank you so much for staying up so late. Israel time, we really appreciate it.
My
And this has
pleasure.
really
my
been a wonderful
pleasure.
series, and we look forward to learning from you in the future. I just want to
Thank
thank
you.
our
It'll be my
sponsors
pleasure.
again. I'm going to send their names and sponsorships in the chat. I would also like to mention that now that it's a new year, UTJ has a membership campaign underway, and we would love it if you join the UTJ. So I'm going to send that link in the chat as well. If you would like to join the Union for Traditional Judaism, you can visit this link here. We'd love to have you join us. Please be in touch, and please be on the lookout for upcoming events and webinars that we are planning. All the planning is underway. We hope to see all of you soon. Thank you so much. Laila Tov, everyone.
All right, good night.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Lila Tov.
Laila Tov, thank you.
I love